I might say in a very old-fashioned conventional discourse relationship, which is me sitting at the front and you very quietly sitting and listening. And everything that I'm about to say is going to undermine this discourse relationship and say that... so I'm going to be profoundly hypocritical for the next half hour, if I may. And I'm going to be hypocritical in another way, in that I think probably with this many people, I often sort of start talking and then say, look, can we talk about that? But I think what I might do is try and say too much in about 30 minutes and then leave 30 minutes for discussion. So does that sound like a way to proceed? I'm interested in the intersection of these three things. Media, and we know that there's something profound happening in the communications environment, the media environment, and it's sometimes, I work in it every day, but it's sometimes hard to try and get a handle on the shape of those changes. Specifically, if you drill down around literacies, people who know some of my work already around multiliteracies, is particularly what are the forms of meaning making and representation we use in this environment and how are they changing, and then what are the implications of that for learning. So I work in an education school. A lot of what I do is actually around digital technologies, publishing, but I'm also very much interested in how learners might learn in different ways in these new environments. So they're the things that I want to try and touch on in a schematic way. And what I want to do is I want to make a list of 7 affordances, 7 things that I think could be interestingly different about this new media, which we're touching on in all sorts of ways. And by way of background, I work with Mary Kalantzis, University of Illinois, and this is very much a description of our joint project. What people talk about in this moment is this idea of disruptive change. The video stores are all closing down. When will the last newspaper be printed? As in, sort of printing presses that produce those things. So, and when will the last paid journalist be a paid journalist? There's a whole crisis in journalism at the moment. So we live in a moment where there are these radical changes going on, which are both exciting in one moment and unsettling in the next. And what I want to do is I want to start with a school, because one of the places where I think profoundly disruptive change may happen, and actually should happen, is in the school. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some pictures of a discursive relationship which is the same as the one that I have with you now. So here we have the kids sitting in desks which are bolted in that way. For what communicative reason? I'm interested in this as an information architecture. This room is, if you like, architecturally, it's a technology. It's a communications technology. Then turning around the other way, here's the teacher sitting at the front of the room, up on a little stage. And what I want to ask you about, the obvious question about lines of sight, discursive relationships, who's facing who, and what kinds of discourse are framed by that. Then we have a relationship of the learner to a text. So what is happening discursively between that text and the child's mind? What's the relationship of that to the pen and the piece of paper, where something is being transferred through a kind of a set of discursive relationships onto the piece of paper? Then, looking back into the classroom, something disruptive is happening here, something bad is happening here, probably bad. I'm assuming it could be bad, in that one of the children, the little girl there, is looking up. She's probably daydreaming, which is off topic, off discourse. Maybe she's thinking about what's the answer to a question, but I'm going to suspect it's not. And then something disruptive happens, even more seriously disruptive, in the next image. The only way to actually establish a relationship with the other student is to turn around and talk to them. And I'm assuming this, because she's smiling, I'm assuming it's off topic. So this is, if you like, a counterpoint to the kinds of disruptive changes in the relationship of students to text, to learning. Those three things at the front, media, literacies, learning, which I think the new digital environment could produce. But what I want to do is I want to start with a trivial pursuit question. And I'm not going to, because it's a sort of a silly question at one level. Actually, it's a serious question. You've got to answer this question for yourselves and then check whether you got it right. Okay? And you don't have to admit to anybody you got it wrong in the nature of trivial pursuit. So the question is this. when was the first large-scale digitization of text? In other words, the text we received, here we've got a newspaper, we've got books, we live in this world of print. When did a large part of in what year did a large part of the production process of text become digitized? And what was it that did it? Right, so you got your answer in your heads? Okay? And this is my silly Trivial Pursuit answer, which you didn't have to know. Electronic typesetting happened actually very early. It happened in the 60s. 1967, this is the US government printing office, the Linatron 1010, with the tapes and all that sort of stuff. And what happened was, it was the beginnings of of word processing in which text was kept on the tape, and it was then printed initially on big drums. If anybody saw an old Linotype typesetter, a photo typesetter, there were drums with characters on them which span around and printed one character after another onto a piece of bromide paper, which then got laid up. Now, it was actually a hybrid kind of process, but text in a significant way got digitized, and letterpress printing got displaced by this from about the mid-1960s. Now, the reason why I say this is because I think what's important is that's a long time ago. A lot of digitization of text was happening a long time ago. And a friend and colleague of mine, Jean-Claude Godin, a Canadian, who some of you people in the library science area may know quite well, says, look, we live in the digital incunabula. People, if you know librarianship, the incunabula is this first 50 years between 1450 and 1500 when a lot of texts are produced. But the information architecture of the book doesn't really happen until after 1500. And we're only 50 years into this process, barely, and it may well be that a lot of what's possible has barely yet happened. And in a way, that's part of what my theme is here. So I want to start with a couple of points about, I've got 7 things I want to address, but I want to start with 2 things which I think are red herrings, which are not useful questions, and also not new learning. And the first thing is, one of my bugbears is the idea of the virtual, which I don't think is an interesting idea. So this is a little image here of the virtual husband, right? So ever since we've had technologies where it's possible to communicate across distances, everything's been virtual. And in fact, it started with the book. It started with writing, where it was possible to represent something at a distance. So in a sense, this sensation of meaning and distance is deeply with us in our natures and has been for a long, long time, since the beginning of writing, but certainly on a large scale since the coming of the book. But in classrooms, there's a word that I often use, which is there's a strange thing about classrooms and schools, is that everything is virtual. You're talking about the planets, you're talking about atoms, you're talking about everything is actually exaphoric reference. It's reference to the world outside of the classroom. So all classroom discourses that, and whether we have it in a textbook or we have it in digital media, is sort of at one level trivia. The second thing about not new media is the idea of hypertext. Everything's non-linear. We live in this world of non-linear texts. Well, this is my story of non-linear texts. This happens in the middle of the 15th century, in 1450. And in fact, we were talking about this last night. This is an incredibly beautiful page of one of the Gutenberg Bibles, the first printed text. But in fact, connecting with the world of manuscript and scribal culture, look at that beautiful illumination around the handy illumination around the outside. But this is a text that has no contents page, no index, no numbered referencing along the way, and in fact cannot be dealt with hypertextually. And in fact, by 1500, the greatest invention of modern information science is created, which is the page number, right? So, and that allows referencing to a specific point, so the whole apparatus then of cataloguing, indexing, tables of contents are deeply hypertextual. There's so much text in the world, you've got to navigate your way around it, and everything's hypertextual. So what you do with a link is just you speed up something which is intrinsic to all these texts anyhow. What's very interesting, and I've got a kind of pedagogical point here, is by about 1500, the information architecture of the modern world's invented, and it isn't typography that does it. This is, I don't know whether people know this, Petrus Ramus was one of the most published people in early modern times, a French professor who did nothing original but did something profoundly original. What he did that wasn't original was regurgitated, in this case, Euclid, Greek geometry, and Aristotle, and he regurgitated everybody, but he did it in a way that they never did. Their pedagogical mode was oral and dialogical. What he did is he put it on a printed page like this and had little subheadings and italics and numbers like 8, 9, 10, 11, and so on. So it was possible to systematically lay out from from easy bits to hard bits, things pedagogical, and systematically possible to find them. So what he builds is a kind of a spatial epistemology laid out in this form of the page. And in a sense, everything we do in the world of the digital is another version of this. So every time we click across from this to this, or we reference this, or we search that, functionally we're doing the same kinds of things. So for me, that's a kind of a starting point in this discourse. So I want to now say, look, okay, if these things are not that new, we've been doing them in our world of text for quite a long time, what in fact might be new? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to skip between two things. One is I've been working on a project to build a space, a digital writing space, which is a web-based writing space, which is Google Docs is not a terribly social environment. It scaffolds a set of social relationships. Google Docs has become a bit more social since it allowed more than one person into the same screen at the same time. But in fact, if we want to scaffold these social processes of text construction, we need a lot more than that. And I've been very lucky with a team of others to get a number of quite substantial grants from the US Department of Education to build a new environment. And what I'm going to do, which is a bit bad, if I had a bit more time, I'd take you in and click around and show you things, but I've done some screen grabs, which is just a way of giving you a sense of what it is. If I had even a bit more time, I'd have you do it and take you through some things, but I'm afraid I can't. But also what I'm going to do is try and show that and then talk about an idea. So my first idea is ubiquitous learning. If I could do a login, I'd click on that, but instead here's the screen grab. We've been building this writing environment that we call Scholar, where we've been building a space where learning and knowledge can happen. So what it does, it replaces that piece of paper, it replaces Microsoft Word, it replaces all those things that we do at the moment. But it builds a social environment where you can do historically what happened around text. But my first point about ubiquity is this is a serious problem. Anything involving the web is a serious problem when you involve children. So what we've done is we've built a system, and it's got to be an environment which can also work with adults. So we've actually, one of our big technical things is we've built an environment with sponsored accounts where it's possible for, how do you build an authentication system without an email address built into it, which you can't require children to have emails or require authentication through an email thing. So we've built a whole authentication system with a couple of layers of sponsorship where it's possible to have children working in a full social media environment. Now, what I want to do is I want to sort of just to try to sum up about what's paradoxical about this ubiquity. And look, I want to say something about the proverbial digital divide, and I want to say something which is a little bit provocative. It may well be that very poor people can get into the kinds of environments that I'm talking about now in a way they could never get into conventional environments. Conventional teaching environments required classrooms and they required textbooks, and there was a whole relatively expensive infrastructure which made it, meant that schooling was deeply unequal. But South Africa at the moment, there are people who there are more mobile phones in South Africa than there are people. And people who could never have a landline now have mobile phones. We've been working with a company in India who we know that it's possible to manufacture an iPad-like device for $35 now. So the minute that happens, there's an extraordinary levels of accessibility which weren't there before. But what Ubiquity does for everybody, the poor and the rich, it means that this spatial arrangement, so what we saw in that classroom, the classroom in Greece, was a spatio-temporal arrangement where we had to be confined within these walls, so the people outside that door can't hear what I'm saying, except if you're streaming on the web or something or other, but that's spoiling the game. But also, it's temporally confined. You had to get here at 12, right? So what happens is, for everybody in the world, the spatiotemporal structure of the classroom does not have to exist anymore, but what you need to do is you need to scaffold epistemically what that classroom did, and in pedagogical terms what that classroom did. So that's one of the paradoxes of this environment. And the second thing is, people may know this wonderful quote of Leibniz's, the inventor of calculus. He thought that there was a day when it was possible to, there would be a day when it's possible to figure everything out through calculation. And in a sense, I mean, in the work that we're doing, we're using natural language processing technologies, but also we're aggregating a lot of social data. You'll see bits of this happening in a moment, where it's possible to be calculating what's going on and give learners useful feedback in this. And it's ubiquity and moving stuff into the cloud. I know the cloud's a cliche, but moving stuff off the personal computer into a social environment which makes that possible. Okay, the second idea is what I would call metacognition. And if I was going to click on that link, I could take you to something live. Okay, so I might size this down a bit. Okay, so having said I wouldn't take you to this thing live, I just have. Because there was something missing that I wanted to show you. So what we have here is a space on the left where you can work. So conceptually there are two spaces. On the left is the work, and on the right is about the work. So the left is, and by the way, if you wanted, the right is the social stuff. I'm very pleased with this little window there where you can pull it backwards and forwards. If you want to do just social stuff, or you want the whole screen for your work, you can do either of those things. So anyhow, this is a space where you can type a whole pile of stuff, but most importantly, this here is not a word processor. This is a semantic editor. So these things here actually mean various forms of emphasis. So the metacognition thing is to build an environment where what we're doing, and I'll say this in a dense kind of way, I think most of you will know what I mean. If you don't, we can talk about it later. It's a space which means the only thing you can do is structural and semantic markup, right? That's the only thing you can do. So this is a list, and here, by the way, one of the nice things is you can insert a video, or you can insert sound, or you can insert any other executable file. So if it's a data set or a piece of whatever, you can insert all that stuff. So that's the first thing. It's purely a semantic editor, which is the opposite of word processing. You go into a classroom and you stand at the back of the classroom and you watch kids mucking around with Word, and they change the colours, they change the fonts, Microsoft Word, which is the Gutenberg typographic world, and PDF, in my view, are all the enemy of progress, and we need a kind of a paradigm shift towards structural and semantic markup. That's what this is. And when you want to structure the tool, so I'm going to go up to a work that I'm working on here. I'm working on a work called Climate Change, Its Causes. If I go into here, this is the structure tool where, in fact, I've set up an introduction. I've got a section on historical fluctuations in whatever, the balance of scientific evidence. And in fact, what I'm doing, it's forcing me to think through the information architecture of my climate change essay, which I'm writing. And one thing which is very nice, which I wouldn't have been able to show you but for the fact that I'm now here live, is well, I'll go into one section first and show you where have I actually written something. Sorry, this is just a sample text. And if I want to change the order of my argument, I just do that. So I can just drag things backwards and forwards. So what it does, it forces you, with Word, you scroll on and on and on till forever, hundreds of pages, nightmare. This is about building a structure where it's not a document, it's just a work. You can move bits of one work into another, you can move bits around, but it's about semantically defined components, otherwise known as section 1, heading level 1, heading level 2, and so on. And so that gives you, and as a matter of fact, let me just see if I can do it on this screen. I can show you how, if I open these little things which are not very clear, here's where I have, they're not clear on this. Anyhow, you can open up I've got subsections in there as well, so it's about building an information. So that's what I mean by, it actually engenders a sort of metacognitive thinking about the architecture of the text and what you're actually doing. So there you go, I actually got into that thing live despite my original intentions. So if I go back to my slides here now, okay, we've got work, about the work, we've got structure, and also we've got a thing called checker, which I'm going to show you in a second. So here what we've got is, firstly in this, I could have showed you this live seeing as I was there, but I won't. no documents, the way in which you find things. So, we use all these filing metaphors about, documents which are things like bits of paper, 5 pages long, which go in folders. These are all metaphors out of the world of print. So what we do is we have this idea of works, and then the way you find things is by tagging things, by semantic tags. So that's that going on. And then what we have here, I showed you the structure thing, and there you can see the subheads nicely in place. But also we have a checker in there, and traditional grammar checkers tell you what you've got right and wrong, and they're usually half the time wrong. So what we've done is we've used a whole pile of natural language processing algorithms behind a thing called a checker, which is all it's about is suggesting things. So we have this idea of a change type and a suggested change type, which we've classified under, spelling, you might want to change the spelling, but you might not. Complex expression, here's some alternative words. So conceptually we're doing something quite different there. Now, in terms of this structural and semantic markup, again, my original point about this being old, in fact, this idea was invented in the IBM labs in 1970 in the form of generalized markup language, if people are into the arcane history of technologies. It's a really old idea. It becomes SGML in '86, and this is a lovely, this is actually SGML, no, that says 85. The Oxford English Dictionary is one of the first places to mark stuff up in XML, and this is the Wikipedia entry on SGML, which is quite lovely. You can see here there's sentence, quote, etymology, whatever. So it's marking up the components of a dictionary entry structurally and semantically. But you can see with that structure tool, and with the editor, we're asking children to do exactly the same thing as was invented back there. And why do we need that? So that when my little text comes up on my mobile phone, it'll render as well as it does on my laptop or on a piece of paper or whatever. So there's actually a whole lot of functional reasons around the digital world why that's essential. But we're still often tethered to typographic markup. But interestingly, for me, there's a huge textual shift from Microsoft Word and the like through to Facebook and Twitter, which, that's purely semantic space for exactly those reasons. So my little conclusions about this, this second point is, we do tagging, not paper shuffling. We do this markup stuff. And the meanings are not just congruent and regular. The checker thing down there is about suggesting things in a world of very fluid discussion around the nature of meanings. Okay, the third point is what I would call recursive feedback, a social environment where there's lots of feedback. With my little screen grabs, I want to show you 3 things happening in that about the workspace by way of example. The first thing is what a teacher can do is set up a project. So all the kids, it's a climate change essay, that's what we're going to talk about, and the teacher's setting up a project where all the kids, perhaps in 2 kids writing out the same work, perhaps all separately, and what they do is they're now at step 3, see the breadcrumbs at the top, setting up a project. But what they're doing is they're actually setting up a peer review structure and a peer feedback structure as they set up the project. So for example, they say the number of reviewers, number of peer reviewers. So after you've done your draft, how many of your peers are going to look at it? And down the bottom, privacy, keep the creators anonymous. So it's anonymous peer review, or name, uncheck it and they'll be named, and all the students know who's reviewing each other's work. And what the teachers do is they build up it's an informational essay. They build up here in this about the work side, they build up a set of criteria whereby the students are to review each other's work. And then what happens is, just on that side there it is, that's how the students actually see the criteria against which a good piece of work is going to be written. And then here is, after the peers have reviewed it, they get a whole pile of feedback around those criteria. Right? So in other words, what we're doing is we're we're building a knowledge ecology. Remember the classroom in Greece? The kids couldn't talk to each other. We're building a highly scaffolded environment where the kids talk to each other, actually bringing in purely heritage knowledge and discursive architectures, which is peer review, in this kind of way. The other thing we have in here is annotation. So see here, the person has marked that bit of text on in blue there, and they write a comment there. Look, perhaps you could say this in a kind of different way. And in fact, you can even then add a comment on the comment and talk to the other person. Well, look, perhaps I might say this, perhaps I might say that. And here then is a history of the dialogue around a particular point. So this is a second mechanism that we call annotation. We have a third mechanism in here at the moment, which we call survey, which is, here's a mentor text on climate change. And we've actually built into this, we're not going to argue with anybody who does regular psychometric testing. We've built in regular psychometric testing, except here the students are being asked, well, which piece of evidence, here's a piece of evidence, which argument does it support, a climate skeptic argument or the opposite argument? So what we've built in there, just to conclude this, is what the world of standardised testing does is that it atomizes knowledge, and it. But what we're doing in this space is we're building an environment where writing is a way to do complex performance. It may well be complex performance is reporting on a science experiment. It may well be that it's writing an argument about climate change or whatever, and that in fact is closer to disciplinary practice than a tick a box right or wrong answer about A, glaciers, B, the Antarctic, C, all of the above, So in other words, we're trying to build this environment where there's a whole lot of structured feedback coming in, which is otherwise known as formative assessment, but also building a lot of data that goes with that. So, collaborative intelligence. These are three things we've built, and I'm going to talk about just this thing here. When the work's done, the climate change essay is finished, this comes, it can be published in a bookstore, and these things down, it's all Latin text for a mock-up, I'm afraid, because we're still working on this. But these are where the students' works come out, their finished climate change report, for example. And this is a Facebooky page, but what we're doing is we're deliberately, the way Facebook is nuanced is around friendship. It's unsalvageable as a learning environment because it mixes this and that. So what we've done is built an environment where the underlying code does the same kind of thing, but the logic is one of peers. There's a sort of a certain seriousness around collaborative knowledge and sharing things with each other. The logic of Twitter is nuanced around followers. This is not about following. So what it's possible to do is through the activity stream down the middle is have a dialogue around this work. And what we've modelled this on, this is kind of the end of the process after the writing's happened, is a hybrid between a blogging space and Facebook and LinkedIn, a kind of a profile-y kind of page. So in other words, the point I've just made about nuances, but also one of the things is that because we're instantly recording everything, stuff that's in a Word file is lost forever. Stuff that's in emails is lost forever. Because every interaction we're instantly recording, it offers the opportunity, and I would also say the responsibility for incidental data analysis. So we're building all sorts of dashboards in there which give the teacher feedback about what's going on. So the next point I want to make is about multimodal representation. And again, you've seen this, you can put videos in this space. If people know, and this is an example of being about to upload a video, if people know our multi-literacies work, we have a whole theory around multimodality. But one of the ironies, I think, about this moment is that we, despite the web, and it's possible to reduce everything to these, digital representations, image, sound, writing, we still have representational silos. I mean, really YouTube just does video, and Flickr just does still images, and blogging is essentially a writing space. So what we've aimed to do with this is build a space where it is possible to do your science report. Here are my hypotheses. Here's my little video I've taken on my phone of what happened during the experiment. Here's a little data set that I've put together, and I'll upload an Excel file into there, and so on. So that's one of the things that we've been trying to do in this space. The second last thing is what we call epistemic agency. It's about framing students as knowledge producers. So for example, here's a whole pile of projects going on at the moment where the kids are actually constructing knowledge themselves by using multiple sources, reaching out for stuff on the web, working with each other, and so on. And in a way, this is part of a paradigm shift. This is the old world. There's a kind of a representational aura around the encyclopedia. I mean, why would Arthur Miller stand in front of an encyclopedia like that? Because he is one of those kind of people, and Marilyn Monroe is as well. But in a sense, nothing happens with this. It just simply, discursively nothing changes. So one of the questions is, what Wikipedia does is genuinely change the social relationships of knowledge production. So in the science area, here's, for example, a representation of an argument structure around a climate change essay, right? So in other words, what we're asking to, instead of telling the students about climate change, it's about them building in this space an argument where underlying that text that they've produced is a whole set of very, very powerful epistemic moves which emulate the moves that climate scientists do. For us, in terms of this new media world, we know there's this shifts in the balance of agency where, when you're doing Facebook, you're as much a writer as a reader. And when you're rearranging your apps or building your playlist on your iPod, you're as much a creator as a consumer. But likewise with learning is how do we actually, remember the little boy in the class with the textbook and in one end and out in the writing? Well, we want to change those hierarchical knowledge flows to lateral knowledge flows, and the classroom is a good place to do that. My very last point is this provides unbelievable opportunities for differentiated learning. Really, that teacher in that classroom in that village, the kids more or less had to be doing the same thing at the same time, otherwise it was a shambles. But in fact, in the project environment, here we've got a dozen hypothetical students doing different things, and they're all up to different stages. But over here, this is the publisher application now. Here over here is they can actually construct different groups of students doing different things. So you can have variable pace doing the same thing. You can have different people and this is a kind of a dashboard where you can see where everybody's up to. And by the way, if you click on the work, the teacher can always see exactly what the work is at any one point. It's out there on a server. Click on the work and you can see exactly what the kid has done. And with this comes a messaging service. So what we've done is crazily ambitiously is we've replaced Word and also we've replaced email. So in other words, what happens in this space, it says, look, there's a project, would you start writing a climate change project, and a messaging system where it's possible to talk to other people. So this means it's possible not to have every learner on the same page at the same time. But one of the things about difference and diversity is the minute you make space for agency, the differences become more powerful and more poignant than they ever were before. So you work on the assumption that everyone's the same, and everyone will be not the same, but more the same than what they would be if you actually worked in the assumption they're going to do things differently. So difference actually becomes A, a manageable issue, and B, a hugely powerful and important issue in a way that it wasn't in the past. So they're the 7 things which are affordances in this space, which I think really change A, literacies, which is the discursive relationship, and B, learning, the kinds of ways in which knowledge is constructed in a learning environment. So just to end off, we're doing research on this stuff. We're out there in classrooms at the moment, and we're back into the old school trying to prove things like this. You don't have to worry about all this. Can I say? I'm not in the United States anymore. I can say this, can't I? In Canada, this kind of experimental voodoo. You know what I mean? Randomised controlled experimentation, where you prove things because you've got so many people doing the same thing at the same time. So we're in the business of actually trying to do that stuff because it's the only thing that is regarded as truth in that paradigm. But one of the lessons for me is that, in a way, everyone becomes learners now. So the teachers are learning because they've got a very good view of learning about their students, and they're in an environment where they've got a lot of data about their students and whatever. But also what we're doing is creating a learning environment that, a teaching environment that's a learning environment, where we've got machine learning supporting student learning, supporting teacher learning. And in a way, but though, learning is the new teaching, because in these peer relationships where you're giving feedback, the feedback's been scaffolded around those different things, annotation, formats, reviews, surveys or whatever, but it's peers giving feedback to each other and actually in the place of the teacher doing what the teacher, so the teacher builds scaffolds which replicate what they did in relation to the student, and these horizontal relationships become lateral relationships, horizontal relationships. So in a sense, learners become teachers, and teaching is an environment where there's a lot of data which needs to be processed and you need to learn. So what we have here is these are a lot of things we've always aspired to do in education, but now for me, one of the things is there's a new economy of effort. It becomes feasible in a way that it wasn't in that classroom that we saw before. So just to end off, I need to say thank you to the cast of thousands who are involved in this. To build these things and to do these things is a hugely expensive software development process and research process, and we've been very lucky to get these grants from the US Department of Education, which underwrites the whole process. I can send you this. If you want to read more, here are some references about the work that I've done and Mary Kalantzis has done in this space. And very, very last, if anybody's interested in being a part of this, I can get you a login and say how you might want to be, how you might be a part of this. And this is a little, there's a URL there with some information about it. Okay, I've probably gone over time now because because when I went out, how am I going for time?
Yeah, 1:45.
Oh, could be worse. Could be worse. So anyhow, look, I'll go back to where I started. My apologies for haranguing you for this amount of time and making you sit still, because the future will not be like this. The future will be better. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just a clarification question.
Yeah.
And how do you see this system being used? Because my response to it would be very different if you see this in every classroom, in every context, or if this is primarily to facilitate distance learning in certain contexts. So where do you
know what? We've tried to build it so it's completely agnostic about that. But our hidden assumption is that it could be for distance learning. It could be just in a classroom and used to do as a better way to do what's conventionally done. But because it can actually be used in any other way, it's subtly subversive of the four walls and the timetable. Because once a teacher has set up a project, which is a scaffold around reviews, and it can happen more or less on its own, anytime, anywhere, anyhow. So that's, and that is subversive. That actually then, do it in the classroom if you like, but after a while the classroom doesn't become a condition for learning.
I'm wondering with children using this, whether or not you've bumped into any kind of performance anxiety issues. In other words,
yeah.
If you're in a regular classroom, it's good to be a small number of people who respond to a question, but that's a moment in time when it's gone, and if they've made a fool of themselves, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
But as it is, there's still a lot of performance anxiety about putting up your hand. So this is actually being recorded. Your other peers are going to be able to comment on what you've written, and so on and so forth. And I'm just curious to know if you factored that in.
Yes, look, let me just give a couple of answers to that. One is, if the teacher turns on the anonymous bit, that provides a whole pile of openings for students who, for one reason or another, didn't talk a lot. So because it's like blind peer review in the academic context. So the anonymous option is a way of creating a segue which allows a kind of openness for more students. The bigger and most interesting, or another issue, and a more interesting issue for me, or a very interesting issue, is students getting feedback which they don't regard as helpful. And it might be, I don't agree with this, or I think this is silly, or I think this is fantastic, all of which are not helpful comments. So as part of the recursiveness thing, we're building a thing where you can give feedback on feedback and you can rate the rater. So it's a way to actually build incentives to give more constructive feedback, be it critical or positive. So one of the things is to try to scaffold. What happens is all these social media spaces are there because they recursively scaffold reasons to be there, right? So we have to recursively scaffold reasons for learners to be there so that whatever initial anxieties they have, to get back to your original point, become reasons to be there. So yeah, and you're right. And in the first wave, we discovered the kids saying, those kinds of things, but hopefully it's an environment where they get better at giving feedback with time. Yeah, Caroline.
One of the things that, when I think about this, yes, we're moving now to the collaborative learning idea, interaction and pooling of knowledge and the knowledge process. But now you're introducing a whole pile of mental models about collaboration. So before, the mental model was about semantic categories. I could say that I can use Word to do pretty well anything. But mentally, I know that when I put it in bold, it means something to me.
Yeah.
And so that was a semantic construct that I had in my head, that when I do this, it means this. But now we're moving to the next stage of saying, on top of that, you now have mental models about collaboration. So what does it mean when I put a comment in for somebody?
Yeah.
So the next stage then makes me want to say, okay, now I need symbols of collaborative type. So how far are we going to go on those sorts of things?
Well, what's bold to you is italic to me, by the way, so that's why we don't,
Oh, yeah.
I'm being, that's the whole point about, so in a way they're two objectives. So one is this kind of metacognitive thing about thinking about textual architectures and thinking about it in a consistent way. And the other thing is to build these environments which, in a way, scaffold collaborations. Like this stuff, we can be very collaborative in a whole lot of ways in life, and we are, but this is about scaffolding it and building in a way, what it's built on is a number of canonical scaffolds. One canonical scaffold is rubric-based review. Another canonical scaffold is comments which are based on a set of annotation labels, types of comments. And another canonical scaffold is the survey type, whatever. So all we're really doing is importing those canonical feedback scaffolds, which are used for assessment everywhere in the world, into this space. So hopefully that gets you able to think in these usefully evaluative ways as a matter of practice. But that means that actually your practice of writing is a deeply social practice, otherwise known as the person who was the proofreader of James Joyce's Ulysses, you know what I mean? That was a deeply social process as well. So always knowledge construction and textual construction has always been deeply social. But except children's writing, where they got the answer back with a whole lot of errors and the answer was 46. So in other words, we're trying to import whatever was strong in those historical practices around text, around the collaborative and social nature of text into, yeah. Does that answer sort of?
Yeah, and it's, what I'm saying is you're accepting a lot of paradigms already, and in a sense, I don't think I think there's an option to break it open even more, which I'm sure you feel, but this seems to, as you said, accepts some of those rubrics as what you must work with at the moment, while also trying to abandon the idea of formal essay production.
And also, one of the things, in the digital world, we have a lot of models, incredibly sophisticated models of feedback mechanisms. The rate the rate of moderation system in Slashdot, for example, has models in it which are far more sophisticated than anything that happened in old-fashioned publishers, although it's the same kind of thing. There's a lot to learn from this digital world about doing stuff in better ways than in the past as well.
So the one laptop per child in the middle of the 2000s made an attempt to do some of the similar things it sounds like that you're doing, especially the collaborative learning. It sounds really similar to the way that the teacher is able to monitor all the things that children are doing who are connected through the little exo green computers. I wonder, are you drawing on the same basis of ideas, or are you being inspired by a technology that was developed for the developing world?
The one laptop child, there's nothing, that was the right thing to try to do. It just, sometimes people try to do the right thing and for inexplicable reasons, it doesn't work. I mean, our feeling is the latest lot of tablets. And, like in India at the moment, there are 15 or 20 tablet manufacturers. It's just really crazy. And, it is a disgrace that iPads cost what they cost, because what do they cost to manufacture? Not much at all. So we're paying I don't know the figures for iPads, but an iPhone costs $12 or $14 to manufacture. So, so in other words, that I think that although the one laptop per child thing was a great idea, it just happened not to work. But also that browser technology is now so ubiquitous. What the one laptop per child tried to do is build a whole operating system of its own. But because you've got to use these incredibly ubiquitous browser technologies, because it's going to work on a lot of things. Computers, laptops, upright computers, laptops, anything, So that's one of the things that might have made it hard for them.
So you mentioned early on about mobiles and about extra reach with the different kinds of platforms, so that people who couldn't get to these formal educational environments would be more able to get education. So how does that work with your system there? Does it work on a mobile at this point, or
you know what?
Do you expect it to?
Let me tell you one of the curses of the Apple situation. That it's I hope it's going to change, but at the moment, no on an iPad. And the reason why is the iPad operating system will not allow you to do what you can do in a regular browser. So the difference between the iPad Safari and the Safari on a laptop is quite substantial. They're converging now, but for me the lessons is iPads were constructed as consumption devices, not creation devices. There were things where you paid your money and got a book, paid your money, got a movie, paid your money and do this. So in other words, when you actually drill into the Safari for iPad, it's a one-way, it's the old transmission model of knowledge. We're hoping that the new versions of it will be slightly better. They promise. So one of the things is this swipe stuff is okay for taking things in, but it's not okay for locating things when you want to put things into the device. So we're hoping that'll change, but the solution is to go around it and to find a $35 whatever that uses Firefox, $35, you know what I mean? That's the solution. But it's the problematic Apple story, I'm afraid. We noticed today they finally killed Flash. So Flash, did you notice that, the news? So Apple have killed they've stopped trying to develop Flash for mobile devices as of today, and that's the end of Flash effectively because there are so many mobile devices. So they play a very dirty game, but I'm hoping that there's enough need for people to be able to input stuff effectively through a browser interface for them to come round in later versions of Safari. So that's what we're hoping. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that you looked at Facebook and found these environments were you couldn't embed some of the ideas that you had about collaborative knowledge generation into these platforms. And so my question was that, is it practical to create a new environment and then sort of expect people to come along, or would it have been a better thing? Could you have looked further into how you build the scaffold on top of environments that are ubiquitously used, like Facebook, LinkedIn, you name it? Some of these
Look, the short answer is I don't think you can use Facebook. And there are two kinds of reasons. One is that it's a kind of set of friendship dialogues which are, the forms of interaction are defined around how it defines friendship. But also simply the words it uses. The idea of a friend is not, it's not useful in a kind of learning environment. So for us, there's a discursive nuancing in these spaces. And likewise, LinkedIn is not a sharing space. There's also all sorts of problems around kids and access and authentication and duty of care. You simply can't use any of these spaces anyhow. You couldn't in a classroom ask kids to use Facebook or LinkedIn. So even if they were okay, you can't use them. And there are very good reasons why you can't use them. So what we've tried to build is an environment where we built this two-layered authentication structure. One for, our definition is just simply date of birth, under 18, over 18. So in terms of how you'll authenticate. But there's only one way to authenticate into any of those things, and that's via an email address, and then it's public, and then all the problems that flow after that.
I'm wondering if there is a tension between this social and collaborative approach to education and the individualistic approach. I guess my questions are around the relationship between an individual student and an individual teacher. That can be a very powerful one. And the limitations of very diverse classroom environments where the collaborative experience is very negative for some students.
Now, let me tell you what we try to do in this space. I've emphasised collaboration, but we have tried to be agnostic about a lot of things. So this is how you use this space in a purely conventional way with no collaboration. The student is given an assignment to do a text to write, the climate change text. The teacher's got the review criteria in there, and maybe the teacher might ask the kid to self-review, give yourself a mark, look at the criteria, and then after you've done that, write a new draft. And then at the end, the person who goes through the review criteria is the teacher, right? And that's a purely non-collaborative relationship. So our desire with this is not to be pedagogically prescriptive, but to build an environment which is agnostic about all those scenarios. But you know what? The idea of affordance, I like the idea of affordance. You know what? A funny thing about affordance is you don't have to do anything, but once you can, you often do, right? But we're not saying you have to do it. We're just saying, but when you can, you discover there might be a whole lot of benefits in it. So in other words, you could run an entirely conventional classroom in this space, and you could run it in a way which we think is better than the normal, way, because it might make the review criteria more explicit as you're writing. It might give you the chance of iterating across different versions, self-analysing how you're going, giving yourself a score, all sorts of interesting things, and that's called neatly individualised instruction, and that's really a kind of a policy decision of the teacher.
We have time for one more question.
So how have teachers felt about it?
It changes the thing so much that it's daunting. So that's, and you know what you've got to do with all these new things, you've got to argue that at the end of the day, this will make your job easier and better, but there's a learning curve. If the kids are merrily working away at their work and you can click in and see what they're doing and keep an eye on it and whatever, if you can set a whole lot of balls rolling with a whole lot of students in these kinds of ways, ultimately it'll make your job easier. But what it does, it constructs the teacher in a very different way to what they were historically, discursively, but also, if you've got to build a kind of a rubric and you've got to build a project scaffold, there's a bit of work in that, which is not more work than just walking to the classroom and say to the kids, open up at chapter 7. It's a different sort of ball game. So the answer is, it's new.
All right, and on that note, a generous thank you to our speaker, Bill Cope, today for his illuminating presentation.